Good evening. This is Leo Meyer and my wonderful associate, Miss
Dolly Curtis,
here tonight with the new edition of Backstage Buzz. And tonight we have a special treat in store for you. One of the great ladies of the American theater, a working legend who has started as a kid and has never stopped and has a resume that is to be admired and just worshipped. Our favorite lady of the evening is Elizabeth McCann, producer, manager, general manager, lawyer, writer, you name it. Liz, welcome aboard. It's wonderful that you're available to us tonight. I can't thank you enough.
Well, Leo, you and I have known each other for a long time and been friends for a long time.
It's true, and we're still speaking.
We have this chance to talk.
Right. And it's been a long time. We did many shows together, and it was a wonderful time for me, I'll tell you. I always loved working with you and your partner at the time.
Leo says that he built a lot of the shows, Liz.
He certainly did.
That's great.
He had a wonderful scene shop. Absolutely.
Certainly did. I was there many times.
Well, you have to tell me how, as a child, living in the city, being brought up in the city, how you became infatuated with the stage at a young and tender age.
Gee, I really have to think a second. Well, you're right. I did grow up in the city, and neither one of my parents. I wasn't taken to the theater as a kid. We used to go to the movies all the time. I didn't go to the theater till I was into high school, and it happened because a cousin of mine came in from New Jersey. And she had 2 tickets to Cyrano de Bergerac, starring Jose Ferrer. And her girlfriend hadn't been able to come with her. So my mother said, you have to go with your cousin Annie. She doesn't want to be alone. Well, I didn't particularly want to go to the theater. First of all, I was kind of an Irish kid, and I couldn't figure out what Cyrano de Bergerac could possibly mean. I could barely pronounce it. And then some actor named Jose Ferrer it sounded it didn't sound like much. Well, anyway, we went, I believe, to the Barrymore Theater, and I know we sat in the balcony, and I just fell totally in love from that moment on. I've always said the best thing to do is to take a kid. People tend to say, we're going to take kids to Shakespeare, we're going to take kids to... Take them to a good old rip-roaring sort of melodrama romance. I was hooked, totally hooked. That last line, I have loved but one man and lost him twice, I can still remember. And Jose Ferrer, of course, was brilliant. And that was it. That was the beginning of my love affair, and that was, fortunately for me, the first experience I had of a Broadway play.
And then he later, of course, did it on film.
Yes. But, to me, film is never the same as theater.
Your career is so illustrious, and it's amazing that it is so tailored to the legitimate stage. You never really got carried away with working in film or Hollywood or any of it, or much TV.
Well, I think it was just what my first love affair was.
Mm-hmm.
And I lived in New York. We lived on 31st Street, and Broadway was, or the theater district was just up the street on 42nd Street.
Right.
So,
how did you get into the business aspect of it as a youngster?
Well, when I got out of school, I didn't know quite what I wanted to do, and I had an older cousin who always knew the answer to everything, of course, and she said I should go to work for an ad agency because ad agencies made television shows. Anyway, I got a job at an ad agency for about 2 years, and I was reading the paper one day, and there was a company starting up at the Cherry Lane Theater on Commerce Street. And they were 3 friends from the University of Wisconsin, and they were starting their own little theater company. So I wrote them a letter and said I'd like to come work for them.
Get a job.
But you were not in law school yet, right?
No, that's much later. And
Later.
first, they were doing a production of Way of the World.
Oh, the Congreve play,
And,
wonderful.
they had gotten very good notices, and they were very well regarded. This is a time when Off-Broadway was just kind of beginning to be something. Like Circle in the Square was just beginning, and it wasn't really regarded as, and they were suddenly, people were taking a look at this little company. Anyway, down I went, and they looked at me and they said, well, we can't hire anybody. We haven't got any money.
Of course.
The universal line in the theater.
Yeah,
Right.
And they said, but if you'd like to come and help us, of course, be a volunteer. So I did. I started as an usher, like 3 nights a week or something. And they had somebody else. I remember a girl named Betsy Katzen, and she and I alternated ushers. Cherry Lane was a very small theater. You didn't need more than 1 usher. And then I graduated to the box office. And then finally, they were an extraordinary 3 people. And they found enough to pay Betsy and I $5 a week, which was an extraordinary sum for us. We were thrilled to death. And then what happened after they did
The Way of the World.
Way of the World, they did a production called Thieves' Carnival, for which they won a special Tony. And they were terribly successful at this point.
And you were with a hit.
There I was with a hit. Now, at this point, Sybil, who was the partner who was sort of the business manager, she'd gotten an opportunity to go to work for a man named George Schaefer in the Hallmark Hall of Fame. So she didn't want to put in the hours that she'd put in, and they said, would I like to do Sybil's job while she was uptown doing working with George? And they would pay me $50 a week. Well, this was an awesome amount of money.
Wow.
Well, I was
In those days.
I was still living with my parents as a good Irish daughter, and I told my parents I wanted to take this job at $50 a week. Well, they thought I was absolutely crazy, because I could probably make $60 a week at the ad agency. But I prevailed, and I went to work for them. And I went to work for them until, unfortunately, they had 2 unfortunate failures in a row. God, I remember this first one, but I can't remember. The second one turned out, believe it or not, to be Mornings at 7.
Really?
Got wonderful notices, but didn't do any business. And that plays into my story much later on. So with the failure of these 2 plays, they ran out of money, and they decided to close up. So I started around to try and get a job with their help. And I ended up working with a man named Maurice Evans.
The famous actor.
Famous actor who at that time had a play on. Maurice was a famous actor producer, and he had produced a play called No Time for Sergeants.
Oh, yeah,
and
big
it was
hit.
running on Broadway, and they needed an assistant, and so that was my first sort of. I wasn't there at the very beginning, but I was there as the show was running on, and he had an office in the Paramount Theater building, and there I was on Broadway.
And you never left.
I never left. And the fascinating thing about it is that in those days, at a place like the Cherry Lane was set up exactly like a Broadway company in miniature. They had budgets, and they had box office receipts, and they had profit and loss statements. They were very much a mini of Broadway. So I'd had a certain amount of training, and then when I went to Broadway, I already knew a little bit about getting my way around. And I can't remember where I ended up after. Oh, God, I ended up with a guy named Martin Tossi, who was producing road shows, and I've had all kinds of strange adventures now that I think back on it. I'm trying to remember, Leo, did you do Mornings at 7 for Nell and I? Absolutely incredible show.
Yeah, that was a
and I
wonderful
think
hit.
one thing that helped me is Mornings at 7 was absolutely an accident. It was done out in Chicago, directed by a man named Vivian Madelon, and he begged Nell and I to come out and see it. Well, I had just, broken my leg, and I wasn't about to go to Chicago. And so Nell went, and she called me back, and she said, "This is the funniest play I've ever seen." I said, "You're out of your mind. That play's been done twice and failed." It was done originally on Broadway with Lillian Gish in, I think, 1939, 1940, and failed. And then it was done off-Broadway with a very good cast and failed. "What are you talking about?" "Oh," she said, "it's marvelous." I said, "Well, we'll do it then." So we did, and it turned out to be this absolutely sleeper hit. Out of nowhere, it became a great hit. And I guess you always kind of, something else happened, Leo, about that set. It was designed by William Rittman. And I remember shortly before we did the play, because play in Chicago, we had to build our own set. As I remember thinking to myself, I went to see a revival off Broadway, and it was at the Golden Theater. And while I was coming out of the theater, the guy said to me, who produced it or managed it, "Gee, Liz, we did this for 5 cents and this, that, and the other." And I thought, God, it looks like you did it for 5 cents. And I said to Nell, "Look, it seems to me what we tend to do is when we do a revival, we treat it like an antique. We should treat it like a new play. We should give it the same amount of love and the same amount of expense that we do." And you remember that set was absolutely beautiful. It was an incredible set.
Well, Bill Rittman was a wonderful designer. He also did
He was a wonderful
Death
designer.
Trap.
It was absolutely glorious. And that was one of the first things that I think by an accident of me having read this guy who was bragging about having produced a revival for 10 cents, that I got this notion in my head that revivals should have the same affection that you would give an original production. So there it was, and Nell and I had produced 2 other things on Broadway before that. We produced Dracula, which I don't know whether you did the set for or not.
I didn't do the original. I did the road.
And then we did Elephant Man, I think.
And we
then
did the
came
Elephant
Mornings
Man
at
together.
7.
Right.
Now,
You did
Mornings
My
at
Fat
7
Friend together.
was at the Lyceum Theater, and we would go on a night, and people would come up to me and say, "Oh, it's so wonderful you're doing this play. You made money on 2 shows, and now you're prepared to lose money." And I used to think, "Oh, my God, what have we gotten into?" Because nobody expected anything of Mornings at 7. I mean, it had failed twice. But the other strange thing that happened on that production, I'm telling you all the strange things that happened, is there was a transportation strike. And the city of New York had been closed down, and people had to walk every place.
I remember
and everybody was in a grumbly mood. And that night, and it was raining, and we were holding the curtain slightly in those days, we still had television critics who used to review nightly. And this guy came rushing in who was a television critic for CBS or NBC, and he said, "God, I hope this is going to be good tonight, Liz." He said, "I've been on strike duty for weeks, and I'm exhausted, but thank God the strike is settled." Well, we opened the night the strike was settled, and everybody was so euphoric
Oh, of course.
that there was no strike that it just went off like a great hit. And it was bringing back this old play that nobody ever had any faith in. And it was by Paul Osborne, who was a first-class playwright, but, he hadn't had success. Well, he had success, but I think he wrote on Borrowed Time. But it was a great adventure for us, and more so than it didn't make as much money as Dracula or Elephant Man. But it was Broadway had a love affair with that play.
Yes, everybody adored it. They really did. It was great.
So what year are we talking about, you two?
Oh, God, I don't know. Leo would have to
Not
remember that. I guess
I don't remember dates, for God's
In the
sake.
90s?
Yeah.
probably.
Yes.
Well, now how enter Jimmy Niederlander.
Yeah,
How did-
Nederlander.
Your association.
Well, he was in the situation before this production of plays. I mean, Jimmy Niederlander, when I first read him, was running the Fisher Theater in Detroit because the Schuberts were, he'd kill me. The Niederlanders were a Detroit family, and they had theaters in Detroit. And I was working, as I think I mentioned earlier, for this guy, Martin Dossi, doing road companies of different things. So we would end up playing Detroit at various times. And that's how I knew Jimmy. I knew him from this association of having shows that went into Detroit. Now time goes on, and Jimmy buys the Palace Theater in New York, and he decides he has to have an office in New York. and he has to have somebody working for him. But Jimmy decided he didn't want anybody working for him who'd ever worked for any other management. I have no idea what that was based on. I think it was a notion that he wanted to be more independent, so he hired me. And I had no idea what he was hiring me to do. I don't think he had any idea what he was hiring me to do. He just hired me. And it was, I met him in September, and he said, "Oh, yeah, I really like you, but I got partners, and I have to clear everything with partners." Jimmy has used that line for his entire life. They were always I'd love to do business with you, but I got to clear it with my partners. Well, and then he said, "Well, I think it'll be okay. Listen, I'll call you back. Maybe we'll get together around Thanksgiving, okay?" I said, "Well, sure." And we agreed on a price. I could swear it was like $100 a week. I can't absolutely remember for sure. And off Jimmy went, and I never heard from him again. Never phoned me again. Thanksgiving came and went. Got to be March, and he called me up and he said, "So, you coming to work tomorrow?" I said, "What are you talking about? You didn't..." "Well, yeah, but I told you." Well, okay, so come the 1st of April, I went to work for Jimmy Niederlander, and he said, "Now, what did we agree on?" I said, $100 a week. He said, "No, we agreed on 90. I thought, oh, God, it's starting. So you had the full range of the Jimmy Niederlander method of negotiation. But he was the most honorable man in the whole world. You never needed a contract with Jimmy. All you needed was his handshake. That's all you needed.
Well, your association with him was long and secure and so wonderful.
It was the most marvelous experience in the world because I agreed to go to work for him, and shortly thereafter, before I was, in between the time of the phone conversation, I was time to go to work for him, I got a call from Hal Prince, who asked me to go to work with him because he was producing Follies. And I went to work. I went to see Hal Prince, of course, and of course he was a real mesmerizing man of the theater. And, what was Jimmy, an out-of-town theater owner from Detroit who bought the Palace Theater? And but I told Jimmy I'd be there, and I didn't particularly want to break my word. And to be frank with you, Hal Prince kind of was so overpowering, he kind of scared me. So I turned down Hal Prince to go to work for Jimmy Niederlander. And it was a wonderful time to work for Jimmy because he was starting up. He was doing business with all kinds of people. Everybody wandered in and out of our lives. I got to know all kinds of people. I got a much broader education than I would in just working on Follies for Hal Prince.
Right.
Jimmy was, Jimmy's basic attitude towards life is, get on with it. And I remember I had no idea what my job was. Variety came out with this big headline that said, "Niederlander hires McCann going into production." I thought, what is this all about? When did he say we were going into production? I have never produced anything. I don't know anything about that. Anyway, we started out, and one of my first assignments, because you never knew what Jimmy was going to ask you to do. He came into the office, he said, "Listen, you got to go down to Philadelphia." There was this nightclub right outside Philadelphia, and Judy Garland was playing there. He said, "You go down and tell me what shape she's in." Well, go to Philadelphia and tell them what shape Judy Garland was in. I'd never seen Judy Garland in my life because, the interesting thing about Julie, and this is a digression, we all know she had a lot of problems. She never had any problems when she played the Palace Theater. We booked her into the Palace. When she played the Palace, it was like she was in the Vatican. It was where she had made her great comeback years ago, and it was like the shows were always perfect. She never fooled around at the Palace. She was just incredible, always. So there we were, Judy Garland at the Palace. And the other thing about Jimmy is, if I'd gone to work for Hal Prince, I'd have known Follies. If I had, in those days, the Schuberts only produced stage plays. Jimmy did whatever he had to do to keep his theaters going. The Palace, it could be Judy Garland, it could be Josephine Baker, it could be anybody in the world that you could name up. He filled his theaters. He'd get Van Cliburn to play an afternoon piano recital. He just kept going.
Hot buns on every seat.
He always kept going. He never took no for an answer. Never, never, never. And, later on, one of his great desires in life, he'd been to London, and that was the other thing about Jimmy. Jimmy started looking overseas for properties. Jimmy went everywhere. And he'd been to London. He'd seen a Royal Shakespeare Company production of Sherlock Holmes. And he wanted to do that production in the worst way. It really appealed to him. But the Royal Shakespeare Company had a verbal agreement with David Merrick, and they weren't about to antagonize David Merrick. So Jimmy would come back from London and say, Janice, do you know how much money I had to spend renting a car to drive from London up to Stratford? And then I get there and they say no. And he'd go back, and he'd come back, and I rented this car, he told me again, and they said no. So this went on for a while, and that was that. And finally, I happened to be in London. Mainly I happened to be in London because I decided I had to take my mother to Rome to meet the Pope or something. And we came back through London. And the other interesting thing about Jimmy that I learned is Jimmy would talk to everybody. I had known more people in New York than Jimmy had. And I'd say to him, you don't want to take a call from him. He's a loser. Jimmy'd say, well, you never know who's going to have something. He would talk to everyone. And in the lobby of my hotel, I ran into this guy. No, it wasn't that way. I called this guy in London, one of the people Jimmy would say, you never know who's going to have something. I thought he was a real loser, but I called him up, and he said, well, gee, Liz, I'm going to be down at the hotel today because I'm having lunch with David Brierly. Now, David Brierly was the famous man that Jimmy had spent all his taxi money on to get up to Stratford. And I said, gee, would you mind if I just stopped by your table and you might introduce me to David Brierly? He said, sure, why not? So that I did that, stopped by, got introduced to David Brierly, talked for a few minutes, went to a matinee, came back from the matinee, and David is running around the lobby of the hotel saying, where have you been? I said, I've been at a matinee. He said, what are you going to matinees for? I said, well, he said, listen, we're going to drop Merrick. We'll go with Needleender. Can you make a deal? I said, right now? He said, yeah, will you make a deal? And I said, yes, thinking, God, I don't have Jimmy's approval for this, but he's always wanted this show. Anyway, and it was too late to call him in New York with the time difference, so David and I sat in the lobby and figured out a deal, shook hands. I called Jimmy, and I said, Jimmy, you got your wish. I didn't have to go to Stratford. I just had to walk into a hotel lobby, and you've got
the show.
Sherlock Holmes.
Wow.
And it was, you learned from Jimmy, it was always about being around and talking to people and being, he was very tenacious. He never gave up. So that began Jimmy's longtime association with Sherlock Holmes, with the Royal Shakespeare Company, which ended up with Nicholas Nickleby.
Yeah.
Right.
And so,
well, in all,
let's see.
Liz,
Maybe you should ask me some questions. I'm running out of...
I want to know about how many shows you actually did, because the list is so lengthy, and I know the list that I have, there are things that are left out. Can you count that many fingers and toes?
You know, I don't really know that I can.
I mean, you have to have done 75 or 100
more. I
or
think it's
100
more.
shows.
You know, Nell and I worked together for a very long time.
Yeah.
And then she had a kind of interest in going to I mean, things were pretty rough in New York at a certain time, and she was sort of interested in seeing what might be out in California. So she went out to California for a while to see what was happening in television. And I never went that way. It didn't appeal to me for some reason. She had a good degree of success in California. And I hung around New York and ended up working with Peter Schaffer and Edward Albee as their producers, which was an amazing achievement for me.
You did every one of Albee's plays, and what a success record.
I mean, I think I produced everything of Albee's for many, many years, and he was an extraordinary character, but I learned, if you get into a situation and you're prepared to listen, watch, and learn, you're ahead of the game. If you go into a situation and you say, okay, I'm going to tell you guys how to do it, you're not going to learn anything.
Right.
And I learned so much from Edward. But I'll tell you something. He was the bane of every light. He used to say, now listen, it's very simple. You turn, the curtain goes up, the lights go on. The end of the play, the lights go off. There are no light cues. Well, Leo, every lighting designer on Broadway used to shudder. It's sort of having to light the show for Edward. And he'd say to me, "Do you see any light change?" I said, "No, I didn't see any light change. You saw a light change?" Because they would sneak them on us, because you were getting into that age of computerized switchboards in which, they put the entire sunset up on the stage if they got a chance. Mm-hmm. But he was a great believer on anything you did on stage that would take the attention away from the words of the playwright was a mistake. And he was right.
Well, wonderful, wonderful playwright. Was he probably one of your favorites? You knew all of them, Tennessee Williams.
Well, I think because we did so much together, we formed a real bond. And he died just about a year ago, and he was an extraordinary man.
Yeah, well.
Well, with all these people you accomplished together, so much theater that people got to enjoy. Think about how many people came.
And you haven't stopped. You're still doing it. It's amazing,
Worked
Liz.
on
Your
the
career has
Tonys.
been so great and solid and wonderful, and you're so respected and loved right on 44th Street. I'll tell you, Julia. Now, quickly before we're coming down the home stretch, we got to talk quickly about Indecent
right.
and the telecast. And your success with that play.
Indecent was a sort of strange adventure for me. I went to see it down at the, I can't remember, the Vineyard Theater. And I went to see it 3 times. I was very taken with it. And Darryl Roth, with whom I had worked on a couple of the Albies, was also associated with it. And I don't know, people were sort of nervous about it. I mean, I remember after it had been open a while, I think it was Paul Libin, as a matter of fact, said to me, Liz, it's really outstanding that you would do that play. I said, what are you talking about? He said, well, it's a Jewish play. You're not. I said, well, it's a Jewish play? He said, didn't you know it was Jewish? I said, it didn't occur to me. And I think somewhere subconsciously I've always believed a play must be universal. If it's a gay play or a Jewish play or an Irish play, but it doesn't have in it that universalness that grasps every audience, you're going to be in trouble. And so when I watched this play, I never judged it in terms of whether it was Jewish or not. I just saw this incredibly wonderful play directed by this extraordinarily talented woman. It was a struggle. We finally kind of pulled it all together, but it was a very, very difficult promotional job. And finally, I don't know what happened. All of a sudden, the audience just decided to come. After we'd been operating, I think 8 or 9 weeks, it losses every week. And the Tonys came, and we announced we were closing in 2 weeks. And Darryl had suddenly gotten very emotional about the play, which is not the wisest thing to do, but in this case, it was very wise. And she called me up and she said, Liz, we can't close this play. I said, you're crazy. We've already posted the closing notice. This is Wednesday matinee. We've sent back every ticket we've previously sold. And as of next Tuesday night's performance, there is not a ticket sold. She said, we've got to keep it running. I said, this is total madness. The famous Paul Libin once more time said, you guys crazy? I said, listen, Darryl says if it has to happen, if she's wrong, she'll underwrite the losses. Mm-hmm. Well, fortunately, for some crazy reason, she wasn't wrong. And they suddenly started coming out of the woodwork. And having run 8 weeks at a loss, we ran for 8 weeks at a profit and ended up returning 20% of the capitalization. And now the television show is coming on PBS. And there's a lot of, it's going to be done at the Guthrie, and it's going to be done hither and yon all over the place. And it's an amazing story, that play.
Well, our time has run out. Unfortunately, we could do 2 more hours, Liz.
All right, thank you, Dolly and David and Leo. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, Liz, and God bless you. And keep up the wonderful work you've always done.
I'll try to. Okay.
Okay, thank you, dear. Good night.